Right, Mike, the big match at the weekend. You gave us a tease at the end of last week's podcast. You told us how much you were looking forward to Bristol Rovers against Swindon this weekend. And it wasn't just because of the proximity of the two clubs, it was because of the two managers in opposite dugouts. Today, we are going to talk about Joey Barton. Of course, we're going to compare and we'll probably contrast with Ben Garner, but Swindon fans will do a separate podcast on Ben Garner in the future. So we are going to focus on Joey Barton primarily today, a man who seemingly is now in danger of being sacked. First of all, Mike, let's sort of rewind and recap what the big story is here for anyone who is unsure. Joey Barton took Bristol Rovers down last season. And if you believe what he says, none of that responsibility was his, despite a really poor points return, a poorer points return than one of his predecessors, Ben Garner. But it's all Garner's fault, isn't it?
Well, this is it. Barton has, the main theme that's run through his tenure today at Bristol Rovers is he seems to keep kicking the can down the road and looking back at all the problems and pointing out all the problems that have gone before him. And Ben Garner seemed to be the number one problem. If you listen to Barton week in, week out, he believed that the pre-season last summer was when all the damage was done. And that when he arrived, the Bristol Rovers players weren't in any fit state to play the type of game he wanted to execute. Little did he seem to realise or care that Ben Garner set them up for, appeared to set them up for what was a COVID season, a very congested schedule. It was about not expending too much energy. It was about trying to win points and keep something back from game to game. And his points per game record suggested that they would have survived had they kept him in charge. They got rid of him. And the subsequent appointments in Paul Tisdale and then especially Joey Barton was no succession plan whatsoever. It was completely different personality types, completely different approaches. And, Ben Garner wasn't building a legacy for another manager that season. He was building what he thought was going to be a team that was going to keep Bristol Rovers in the division and a methodology that was suited to the congested schedule. But Barton didn't see any of this, was full of criticism for Ben Garner, but also in a way that was very, very patronising. He was saying, he was basically playing the experience card because he'd had 3 years at Fleetwood and it was Garner's first job, and was basically, saying, if he wants to pick up the phone to me, I'll give him some pointers on where he went wrong and it might help him in the future. And real delusions of grandeur, I think, on Barton's part, that, he's this well-grounded manager. He had everything his own way at Fleetwood. It was a very enviable job that he had there. And he did make one playoff campaign and then was kind of, didn't step up. They froze in the playoffs and were, no match for Wickham in that two-legged semi-final. So I don't see what grounds Barton has got to be, coming at it this way relative to Ben Garner. And as he's done so many times in his what is still a relatively short managerial career, but as he's done so many times, he's put his foot in his mouth and he's set himself up for an almighty fall. And it sounded like Swindon, they schooled them at the weekend. It was they might not get the two goals that turned it from 1-1 to 3-1 until the last 5 minutes, but it was one-way traffic almost throughout.
Yeah, 2/3 of possession, I believe, as well, and created more chance. Apparently, Bristol was just lumping it up to Brett Pittman and no real plan on how to get through that Swindon defence, it seemed. So on Joey Barton, before we look more at what happened at the weekend, those delusions of grandeur, and he seems to be speaking as if he's a Mick McCarthy or a Neil Warnock or, someone who's had ample experience across the Football League, which, as you've mentioned there, he hasn't. Do these delusions of grandeur perhaps come from his playing career more than what he's done in the dugout, because he was a Premier League player who, played for some top clubs and achieved relative success? He was certainly well known during his time in the top flight. Is that where these delusions of grandeur could possibly come from? Because he believes that he's made it at the top level and he doesn't see Ben Garner as someone who can even lay a glove on him?
I think that's a big part of it. I think the first thing we have to say about Joey Barton is that he had a very good playing career, largely based on his attitude and his non-respect of reputations. I think he punched above his weight as a player. I think basically, I remember him coming through the ranks at Manchester City, and he wasn't the best player in Manchester City's youth academy at the time. but it was kind of apparent immediately as soon as he got onto the pitch that this kid was going to make it, because he was just ready-made to stand up to anybody, and and just didn't seem to be fearful of anybody's reputation. And I think it's got him so far in his career. I think in management, though, you've got to be very careful, because there's a lot of things, that your track record as a player only counts for so much. It only goes so far. And there's a lot of things have to go your way along the way. And, I don't think the same attitude. I think he takes a lot of his inspiration from boxing. He quotes boxing trainers and former boxers a lot and stuff like this. I think this is something I mentioned before. And he basically, it's borderline trash talking, pre-fight type talk. It's like you don't stand down from anybody. You big yourself up, and if that means you've got to put other people down in the process and make them feel smaller than you, then that's what you need to do. I don't think that works in football management. I think you've got to be very careful, because it's very easy for things to come back and bite you. And it's happened time and time again already with Barton. We're talking about a managerial career that's only 4-5 years old. And I can already think of 4 or 5 examples where he's essentially trash talked somebody before the match, tried to play mind games and got it completely wrong. And it's come back to bite him.
Yeah, I was just trying to list some of his skirmishes that he's had. Obviously, the well-documented Daniel Stendhal. One in particular springs to mind. But what I was going to say is you can go back and listen to our Joey Barton podcast. It was very early on, actually. I think it was late October off the top of my head. And he was paired, Mike, in that podcast with another of EFL's firebrands, Steve Evans, because they had a bit of a to-do, a bit of a tete-a-tete on the touchline in that game. That was yet another incident of Joey Barton going head-to-head and locking horns with another manager. Now, do we think he really likes it when the other manager responds and reacts and is wound up by him? Because from what I've seen of Ben Garner, it's quite the opposite. Ben Garner has said that he's seen some of Barton's quotes. He hasn't really read too much into it. He's heard a few rumours from other people, but he's not bothered. He's just concentrating on what his team's doing. He's not interested whatsoever. Is that that's not what Barton wants, surely, is it? Surely he doesn't want someone to play it down. Surely he wants someone to come straight towards him, and he wants a bit of a scrap, doesn't he, essentially? But Garner's not going to give him that.
Yeah, I'm not always sure what Barton's motivation is. Yes, you should imagine he's trying to get a rise. I think if anything, he's just trying to get the upper hand in, almost unsettle his opponent, whether it gets a reaction via the media or not, whether the other guy gets emotional or not, or shows his emotions or not. That might not be the end game. Maybe it's just trying to unsettle or demean the opponent. Certainly in this case with Garner anyway, but Garner was a model of, professionalism, decorum. The way he conducted himself was fantastic throughout. And, he's just not risen to it at all. He's not got involved in the slightest, and he's let the football do the talking. And, you have to say that, given the hand that Garner was dealt pre-season relative to Barton having a few months in the job to set, to weigh things up, then getting a pre-season to himself, a full pre-season, then getting most of his targets at the end of the August window. And there's just no real identity of a team there yet. And yeah, it's like I say, I can only come back to this boxing thing with Barton, that I think he's just impressed by things that he's seen previously and inspired. And I think he's trying to make something translate into football that won't necessarily work.
And a lot of fans were complaining earlier in the summer. Dad's Army was the phrase used. Are we trying to create the oldest and most scouse team you've ever seen? Were other quotes that I spotted on social media. He tends to bring in a lot of familiar faces, players he knows from either his playing career or I guess from his locality, players who are almost trusted lieutenants. Now, this is something that we've talked about before with Paul Cook. He does similar. Sam Morsey, of course, back at Ipswich now is a prime example of that. But is this because Joey Barton knows that these players won't tire of his histrionics, of his, of his outbursts, of his quotes in the media, of his winding up of opposite managers? Because, if you're a player in the dressing room and you hear your manager basically doing the opposition's team talk for them, it must become so frustrating because, when you get on that pitch, the opposition straight at you because of what your manager has said in the press.
Yeah, well, he does. I mean, in terms of his recruitment, he does respect track records. So maybe that, that probably does explain, some of the signings he's made most recently at Bristol Rovers. And I guess, I think he thinks that so long as I know for sure the player is there, I can motivate them. So as much as we're saying he's he's doing the opposition team talk, I think he backs himself to motivate his own players and get that fire in the belly of his own players, like their boxers going out into the ring almost. But yeah, this doesn't work in the same way. You mentioned Paul Cook there, and this doesn't work in the same way of hierarchies and cultural dynamics. And I think this is possibly one of the things about Joey Barton is that he sees all these different aspects of management and he tries to do a little bit of everything. We talk about the mind games. I don't think his personality type is suited to mind games. He's not, he's two learning states and not mind-body aspects. And I think you think of all the good, managers that have indulged in mind games down the years, and most of them have different learning functions. Alex Ferguson, Jose Mourinho, you can list a whole load of managers, and there's very few that don't fall in this. You can almost split personality types into 50-50 of who mind games would suit and who it wouldn't. Barton's from the wouldn't camp, and yet he's probably seen it. He's seen some of these things and think, I like the idea of me, because he does like to push people's buttons and he does like to say things just to see what response he gets. And it's more about feedback and trial and error in the way that he does these kinds of things. He doesn't exactly know. It's not like he future paces in advance in his mind. If I say this is going to, get into the head of the other person. He doesn't necessarily know how the other person is going to react. He just pushes the button to see. But generally speaking, this is not to his skill set to be indulging in these kinds of things. And I think potentially there's an element of Barton doesn't necessarily know, even at this stage, his own identity as a manager yet. I think he's just tried lots of different things. I always believed at Fleetwood, we never really, we always talked about philosophy and identity. I'm not sure that philosophy and identity ever really came through. I'm not sure from the outside looking in what that philosophy was, what that identity was, and it was only their success came towards the end when he finally decided to not go with the two strikers and play one striker or the other in Paddy Madden and Ched Evans. And then suddenly the pieces fell into place. And then they had an identity that was working for them. Now at Bristol Rovers, there's been a lot of changeover of players, but, for as much as Barton's been kicking the can down the road, promising better results in the future, the points per game record doesn't seem to be getting any better. 1 point per game after 10 matches in League Two now. It's barely much better than what he was achieving in League One. So it's a confusing one. He's a bit of an enigmatic character that's not really, you're not really sure exactly what he stands for yet, other than the fact that he's never shy to come out and say things that might get people's backs up, or never, he gives a good interview in terms of headlines, but it's not always joined up thinking along the way that gives supporters a sense that, we know exactly which direction this is going and we like it.
I mean, he's not particularly popular with many supporters for some of his off-the-field antics during his playing career, and certainly some of the things that have come out since. It doesn't make him a popular figure at all. And when you're not particularly popular with your own fans, the one thing you need to do to try and win them back is to deliver on the pitch. And that is something that he's really struggling with now. So assuming then that he gets a little bit longer, and I know, like me, Mike, you've been waiting to see if the axe has been wielded over the last couple of days. It seems not. We're recording on Tuesday, the 5th of October. It is coming up to 8 p.m. when we're recording, and still he remains in the job. So let's assume he has the international break to turn things around. What do you think, if anything, Barton will do differently? Is he the sort to learn from mistakes? Is he the sort to reflect and think about how the season has gone as a whole? Or would he just be all guns blazing straight in, trying to rectify what happened at the weekend?
I'm not sure really how to answer this one, because I think what he will say is, and it's a valid point, is that the squad he's put together at the end of August is about longevity. It's about course and distance over the entire season. I don't think September, October is necessarily when you judge 30-odd-year-old players. I think they come into their own later in the season and, can just use their experience to get results on days when you don't necessarily have to play very well and things like that. But, even only recently, you're losing 4-0 away at Exeter, 4-0 down in 20 odd minutes or whatever it was that day. And then you're coming out in your post-match interview saying, we will get promotion this season. You're kind of backing yourself into a corner there that you can't be in the bottom half of the table at Christmas. When you're saying you're almost guaranteeing, cast iron guarantee to the fans, we will get promoted at the end of the season. That limits your timescale. He's shortening his own timescale by kind of just running off his mouth and saying these things without thinking them through first. And so he's backed himself into a corner up to this point. On the one hand, he seems to not to be taking much responsibility for anything that's gone before, but at the same time, promising things that he can't possibly be sure that he's going to be able to deliver on these promises. So that in itself puts him under increasing pressure in these next couple of months, even though he appears to have built a team that will gradually get stronger and stronger as the season goes on. But he's put himself in a position where he needs instant results. He needs to do this quickly. And I just think a lot of this comes down to the way he frames things from game to game, the things he says that come back to haunt him, and there's no better example on what's happened at the weekend against Bengana because, I really don't think Barton saw this coming. And so many people outside of the club did see it coming, that you run your mouth off like this and you say some of the things he said in such a patronising way. You're setting yourself up for a fall, and I just think he does it time and time again.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but did he also say repeatedly last season, I will keep them up as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's it. And he just, again, it's back to this boxing thing. You can't be shown, you go into a press conference for a pre-match fight, you can't show any weakness in that press conference. But it's a one-to-one combat. So you go in with that attitude and everybody forgives afterwards. The losing fighter, everybody understands that he had to say these things beforehand and he had to believe it as well, before he could get in the ring. Only a certain type of person can get in the ring, and it's the type of person that has got that total and utter belief in themselves in the build-up. But it's forgiven in boxing. In football, you're not responsible. It's the players that are responsible once they cross the white line, and you've got to be careful what you say because you can't speak 100% for those players, and certainly not when you're so early in your tenure and it's not your team necessarily yet. So, these are the dynamics with Barton that, he comes out and says these things like he's a boxer, but it's not him and him alone getting into the ring against one other opponent. It's 11 players who he doesn't necessarily know his own players yet and can't necessarily speak for them because it's clear from the results he's getting and the performances that he doesn't always know what's going on in the heads of his own players because he's not anticipating some of the shocking performances that are coming from time to time. Yet he's going out to the press saying, you've only got to come out. He believes that if his attitude is so bullish, it will rub off on his players, and it's just not been the case at all. So I think this is the big thing more than anything he's got to learn about his managerial career.
If he doesn't make the cut at Bristol Rovers, if he finds himself out of work, do you think a huge risk for another EFL club to appoint him, especially after what has happened with his track record? At Fleetwood, he'd already had a spell at Fleetwood. He was, if you believe what you read, mates with Andy Pilley as well. He got the Bristol Rovers job fairly quickly off the back of leaving Fleetwood. But with, his reputation dwindling, with all this, bluster that comes with Joey Barton, is it too much of a risk for most club owners and chairmen, do you think, to take a punt on Joey Barton going forward if he finds himself available?
I think his next job could be difficult. I think he could be waiting quite a while if this goes the way it appears to be going at the moment at Bristol Rovers. I think it was, for a first-time manager, I think that was a bit of a dream job, the Fleetwood one. And ultimately, he didn't quite deliver. It wasn't an awful tenure by any means, but he didn't deliver in the end. And you didn't feel like anything was building season on season. So, it's this job up to this point has been a bit of a disaster, to be quite honest. I don't think literally, there's not really much you can hang your hat on and say, right, well, he's got this right or he's got that right. It's just been one calamity to the next, and him at the centre of it, never taking responsibility for it. That would be the main concern for me, is the lack of responsibility he seems to take, and yet he's still, he's just still quick to come out and be so bullish, and irrespective of all the evidence. So, yeah, it's a tough one. It's a tough one. I think what he needs to show, I think he's one of those managers that if this job doesn't, if it goes the way it appears to be going at the moment, I think he needs to take time out to reflect and almost demonstrate some sense of humility about his mistakes. Because, I think humility is the big thing that seems to have been lacking in his managerial career today, is the understanding that you've not got total control over things, and that you can't just go into it with this attitude that you know best and everybody else has got to kind of bow to your knowledge and your track record and all of these things as a player. And you can't just talk your way through everything and bluff your way through everything by just talking a good game and being so kind of, just not backing down to everything and being so convinced about your own credentials. It's clearly, there's got to be a bit more substance to it and a bit more humility. And I think that's the big thing I would take out of the Bristol Rovers from his perspective, from the Bristol Rovers job.
Having looked at his personality type and obviously, seeing copious post-match interviews down the years, Mike, do you think humility is something he will discover at any point? Is it in his wheelhouse, do you think, to be humble, to be maybe self-deprecating, to acknowledge the mistakes he's made, or will he plough on regardless and believe that what he did was right and it was everyone else who was at fault?
Yeah, I think the major issue is in terms of as a player and his playing career, he got so far because of this attitude. This unwavering belief in your own ability, this non-fear of other people's reputations is what got him to Premier League standard and gave him a Premier League career or top end of the Championship when he wasn't in the Premier League. So it stood him in good stead as a player. And I think he believes that if I get 11 players and I almost infuse them with the same attitude I always had, then they will overachieve in their careers. And it's all players are different. Each player is an individual, and you can't just sort of carry on, act the way that what served you well as a player and assume it will do the same for everybody else in your dressing room. It's proving not to be the case. So humility would be something new for him, but he is willing to try new things. I would be interested to see. We'll see what happens with Bristol Rovers first, because there's nothing to say that he won't be proven right in the end, and that Bristol Rovers won't go on his surging run, get themselves into the top 7, and then finish the season on a high, and then people are looking back thinking, well, you've got to hand it to him. He was right all along, and maybe that unwavering belief, was what carried him through. But ultimately, if that it doesn't prove to be the case, I'd love to see what his reflections on this Bristol Rovers job would be.
I think if he takes Bristol Rovers up as champions, Mike, my finger will be hovering over the delete button on this podcast, I would imagine. Finally, then, before we move on, what do you think he needs to do now? Do you think it is just a case now of, after the humbling at the weekend, of just keeping his head down, keeping a low profile and cracking on and getting a few results, picking up maybe a few scrappy wins along the way? I mean, that sounds much easier said than done, doesn't it?
Yeah, stop talking. Just stop talking. Talk about the game. Talk about what you've seen. Talk about your process. Stop blaming. Don't blame other people. Don't blame the conditions or the hand you dealt. Even as just throwaway remarks, try to remove it all out of what you're doing and just focus on the football. Head down and crack on now. I think that's the only way. I think that's the only way they've got to approach it, because when you're 4th, 5th from bottom or whatever they are, when you've got the worst XG ratio in the division as they have, when you've brought in the names that you've got, and these are the standards that you're setting, you really want to stay under the radar, and the last thing, you want to quietly creep up the table, not have the focus and the spotlight turned back on you because what the managers had to say in the build up to games or post match. I've listened to a lot of Joey Barton's interviews this season, long before this Swindon game came along and that sense of comeuppance. And I'm kind of just shaking my head every week, like, this could go wrong for you here, the things that you're saying, and you're kind of cringing a little bit at some of the things he's coming out with. I just want to listen to Joey Barton interviews and actually learn a bit more about his own team and about the journey that they're on, and less about, the the mitigating factors that he wants to bring up, the referees, everybody's against Bristol Rovers, and this playing it's everybody's cup final card. I really don't think it is everybody's cup final in League Two, as Barton likes to make out as it is. I think there's a lot of big teams in League Two who are a big attraction, for different reasons. And I don't think it's all about Bristol Rovers, but Barton seems to want to create his own narrative. Just forget the narrative, concentrate on the football and stay under the radar. That's what I'd like to see in the coming weeks.